When we look back on the history of major Japanese game franchises, one development that seems to happen over and over, even though it seems very counterintuitive, is for an important designer to be deeply involved in creating the first and third installments of a series, while having little to no involvement in the second outing. Despite the critical importance of good follow-through and consistency to a franchise's eventual success, over the years it's become something of a tradition in Japan for big-shot game designers to be exiled from series they helped create, while their managers tinker with the formula, presumably under the impression that they can make lightning strike twice by giving the lightning rod a good shake and putting it down somewhere else. Devil May Cry, for instance, largely owed its unique combat mechanics and distinctive style to the influence of former Resident Evil director Hideki Kamiya. But when Capcom began work on a sequel, they decided to hand the reins to a brand new team, mostly composed of people who had worked on arcade fighting games. Their ultimate choice to direct Devil May Cry 2 was Hideaki Itsuno, best known at this point in his career for Power Stone and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? You can't get away from it, I'm telling you. Then we have the Dark Souls series. Now technically, Hidetaka Miyazaki did make 2 Souls games before being sidetracked, and Demon's Souls was a successful game, but Dark Souls was more than that. It was a phenomenon. And it was at this point, when a sequel could absolutely make or break the franchise, that From Software decided to place the reins in the hands of 2 people you never heard of, and let Miyazaki spend his time working on some weirdo goth game about Cockney vampires. The point is, whether anybody realized it at the time, including the man himself, Miyazaki basically was Dark Souls. The series just wasn't the same without him, a fact that FromSoft eventually, to their credit, figured out. Perhaps most relevantly to the subject of this video, Nintendo itself has been known to pull the old switcheroony on even its most prominent and respected employees, like when Shigeru Miyamoto got roped into making Pikmin 2 a much easier and less strategic game than he had wanted, eventually pushing him to seize control of the franchise, so that elements like the time limit could take their rightful place as part of Pikmin 3. This phenomenon actually goes back a long way at Nintendo. Take a look at Zelda 2, for instance. This is a game that was radically different from the original Legend of Zelda, shockingly so in some aspects, but how could it be otherwise when the game was made by an almost completely different group of people? The game had 2 brand new directors, 5 programmers, of whom only one worked on the original, a new designer standing in for Shigeru Miyamoto, and, this still doesn't make sense to me, a composer that wasn't Koji Kondo. But the most sidelined of the original Zelda team members has got to be Takashi Tezuka. This man went from being co-director, co-designer, and co-writer of The Legend of Zelda, basically as important a contributor to every aspect of its design as Miyamoto was, maybe even more, to being just the writer for Zelda 2. And yes, that does mean he's responsible for the typically mute Link uttering his immortal catchphrase, "I found a mirror under the table." But still, being a video game scriptwriter wasn't the most artistically fulfilling of roles back in 1987. And when A Link to the Past came around, you can bet your Pegasus boots that he made up for lost time by putting his personal stamp on the game as its sole director. So why am I bringing this up here and now? Because at around the same time that Zelda was slipping out of the hands of Takashi Tezuka, something very similar was going on in the even more critical Mario franchise. One of the directors of the original Super Mario Bros., a founding partner of the Mario series, had been sidelined from working on Super Mario Bros. 2. The American one, I mean. While other Nintendo employees lavished their attention and ideas on an arguably not very Mario experience, this man waited and planned. He wasn't a big fan of Super Mario Bros. 2, and if he ever again got the chance to make a Mario game his way, he was determined to make it something quite different. The Lost Levels? That was a dead end. He could see that now. Obviously, Mario had to change, and change a lot, but it didn't have to change like this. Surely there must be a way to preserve the feel of the original Super Mario Bros., to update its mechanics while still preserving its addictive pace and fluent platforming, without eliminating practically all the things that had made the original game special. And that man's name was Takashi Tezuka. If you haven't spent much time peeking behind the scenes of Nintendo's evolution as a game studio, then Takashi Tezuka is probably the most important Nintendo employee you never heard of. He's one of the few game designers from the NES era who's still playing an important role at Nintendo today. At the highest level, it's basically just him and Shigeru Miyamoto, and to a lesser extent, Katsuya Eguchi and Hideki Kano. Oh, and Koji Kondo, of course. In some ways, Tezuka comes across as the same kind of personality as Miyamoto, unsurprisingly since Miyamoto was his guide and mentor when he first joined the company in 1984. But there's a critical difference that separates Tezuka from Miyamoto and all the other old-timers still hanging around at Nintendo. He's from Osaka, the largest city in Japan outside the Tokyo area, and a place that is as boisterous and fast-paced as Nintendo's hometown of Kyoto is peaceful and laid back. Now, to be fair, quite a few Nintendo employees of various generations have gone to art school in Osaka, but Tezuka was born in it, molded by it, and I can't help thinking that this has something to do with the unique attitude he's brought to his games. Another important part of his approach is the fact that, like company president Hiroshi Yamauchi, he wasn't a gamer, not in the traditional sense of the word at least. When Shigeru Miyamoto was put in charge of Donkey Kong, he had never designed a game before. But when Tezuka went to work for Nintendo, he had practically never played a game before. He didn't know what Pac-Man was, and the first time he heard about Nintendo's family computer, he thought what most Americans at the time probably thought, that it was some kind of family-oriented home computer, like IBM's PC Junior or something. Tezuka didn't go to work for Nintendo because he was obsessed with video games or electronics in general. He was an art designer, and what he wanted was the opportunity to create fictional characters, like the ones produced by Sanrio or Japanese advertising agencies. But what he didn't want was to have clients or managers breathing down his neck telling him exactly what to design and how to design it, which pretty much ruled out working for an advertising agency. And also probably Sanrio, let's be honest. Nintendo gave him the opportunity to design characters for their games, while giving him some input into who they were, what they would look like, and how they would act. What it got in return was a hard-working designer, whose talents and interests neatly complemented those of its lead designer, Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto was a big idea guy who reveled in the mechanical side of games, focusing on overall atmosphere and broad design concepts. Tezuka, on the other hand, was detail-oriented, and liked to fill in those smaller areas that Miyamoto often overlooked. Tezuka was co-director on the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2, and you can particularly see his artistic touch in that game, since most of its innovations were minor ones. Something as simple as putting cartoon smiley faces on the clouds gave the Mushroom Kingdom a festive air that isn't really in the original, but it became a staple of Mario in the 1990s and hasn't entirely disappeared yet. But both Miyamoto and Tezuka agreed that Super Mario Bros. 3 was going to need much more substantial changes to be worth playing. Miyamoto's initial idea, which was a real swing for the fences, was for the game to be played from an isometric viewpoint, sort of like what would happen years later with Sonic 3D Blast. But that made the platforming too difficult, and it was quickly abandoned. So the stages in Super Mario Bros. 3 ended up looking a lot like the ones from Super Mario Bros., at least superficially. The really striking difference between the level design of these two games isn't so much how you move within stages, as how those stages are arranged. For all the innovations that Super Mario Bros. 2 brought to the series, the overall structure of the game was something that barely changed at all. In the original, you traveled through 8 worlds of 4 stages each, one at a time, unless you found a warp to a specific future stage, and after that you still proceeded linearly. In the Lost Levels, you went through 9 worlds of 4 stages each, followed by 4 bonus worlds, also with 4 stages. Warping was a bit more complicated here, but that didn't change the fact that completing a level would always bring up the next one in the sequence. And in Super Mario Bros. 2, you travel through 7 worlds of 3 stages each, except the last, somewhat compensated for by the fact that its stages tended to be longer. And warps worked exactly the same way they did in the original game, none of the Lost Levels' underhanded trickery here. Super Mario Bros. 3 could not be more different. Worlds in this game no longer have a standard number of stages. Many stages aren't numbered at all, giving the impression that these are unexpected obstacles rather than proper stages. Some stages feel like a classic Mario challenge, moving from left to right through a gauntlet of enemies and traps that lasts, let's say, about a minute and a half from beginning to end. Many other stages are considerably shorter, lasting as little as 20 seconds, depending on how you move through them, and there are a few that are much longer and trickier than a normal stage. But the biggest and most unexpected change is that now, whether or not you use a warp, it's no longer mandatory to complete every stage in a world. In fact, technically, you don't even have to go through all the stages that are mandatory. Because in this game, selecting stages became its own form of gameplay, with the introduction of the map screen. Having the player choose to enter stages from a map instead of just doing them one after the other is one of those ideas that seems obvious in retrospect, but it was something no one had done before when Super Mario Bros. 3 came out. What it does, essentially, is to add another, simpler level of gameplay to the experience, kind of like a board game that exists outside the core gameplay, but also influences it in a variety of ways, ranging from the trivial to the monumental. Obviously, the change with the biggest impact on gameplay is that stages are now arranged across the map, rather than in a straight line. This is what lets you do some stages out of order, or even skip them completely, since they're placed away from the critical path that leads to the castle at the world's end. Another trick that this game likes to use is to have two approaches to a choke point, each of which is blocked off by a numbered stage, forcing you to pick one, but only one, of the stages to play through. Then, of course, you have the pipes, which sometimes allow you to disappear from one corner of the map and pop up somewhere else, which is used both to provide shortcuts and to make traversing the map more interesting. Another element that spices things up is the inclusion of other moving icons besides Mario. These represent patrolling enemies sent by Bowser to take over the kingdom. As soon as you run into them, they'll pull you into a single-screen stage that's really more of a skirmish against one or more enemies, usually some variety of Hammer Brother. These icons move every time you win or lose a level, so it's not uncommon for them to bump into you when you may not be prepared for a fight. Actually, that's almost guaranteed to happen sometimes, since losing a level reverts you to the basic Mario form that dies in one hit, and these are pretty tough enemies. Less menacing are the various toad houses you can find scattered around most worlds. Toad houses simply give you your choice of 3 treasure chests, each of which contains a randomly selected helpful item, although there are secret toad houses with only one chest that's guaranteed to have a super rare item. And finally, we have minigame squares. There are 2 minigames in Super Mario Bros. 3, not counting the spinning panel at the end of normal levels. A slot machine-like game in which you correctly align pictures of a mushroom, flower, or star to earn extra lives, and a card-matching game which rewards you with the items appearing on pairs of cards you successfully flip over. Apart from the stages, what all of these board elements have in common is the potential to give you extra lives or power-ups that are useful either in a stage or on the board. I'll discuss the in-level power-ups later, but let's just take a brief look at the ones you use on the map screen. The music box will put all moving enemies to sleep, preventing them from moving or attacking you for 2 turns, that is, Mario completing a level or dying. Hammers can break boulders that block off certain portions of the map, giving access to numerous secrets. The cloud allows you to pass over a single stage without playing through it. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said you don't have to play stages that you're supposed to play. Although it's worth noting that when you die, Mario returns to the last cleared space, meaning you can easily be sent back over the stage you just skipped and end up having to do it after all. Then there's the warp whistle, which takes the place of warp pipes inside stages and allows you to warp to multiple future worlds at any time. By the way, one of my favorite secrets about this game when I first played it was the fact that if you use a warp whistle inside the warp zone, it takes you directly to World 8 at the end of the game. And finally, there's the anchor. This will pin down the airship in a world, the final stage which is normally able to fly to a different part of the map every time you lose a life in it. This can be a problem because it might fly over a previously optional area, behind stages you haven't gotten past. And I mean, even if you are a completionist who does every stage on principle, it's still a pain in the ass to cross the whole map every time it moves. The anchor forces the airship to stay in one place, so you don't have to track it down, which would have been a relief in some of my playthroughs, but it's well hidden and I never managed to find one myself. Now, having discussed all these new features in Super Mario Bros. 3, we're confronted with an important question. Do these things enhance the basic Mario gameplay, or do they detract from it? The answer to that question might seem obvious at first. Super Mario Bros. 3 is a legendary game, often considered the single greatest NES game of all time. Of course the new features are good. But ask yourself what all these things do. The ability to skip levels off the main path, map items that let you skip even more levels, warp zones that no longer require you to scour levels to find them, constant opportunities to get extra lives and power-ups through minigames without any of the risk of losing lives or power-ups that you would have in normal gameplay. Stages that are themselves full of way more power-ups and one-ups than ever before. All these things have the function of making the game easier. And depending on how well you play the metagame that appears on the world map, it can make some levels absolutely trivial. Gone are the days when you really had to master Mario's running and jumping mechanics. Gone is the spirit of the lost levels, in which you learned exactly how to make a specific jump, and there were no shortcuts to keep you from having to learn. Super Mario Bros. 3 is full of shortcuts, and there's no way that wasn't a disappointment to at least some players who had come to see Mario as a challenge first and a collection of wacky set pieces second. This is really the most lasting impact that Super Mario Bros. 3 had on the Mario series. Its focus on accessibility and variety, rather than mechanical mastery and challenge, and the success which that brought, guaranteed that if Mario had ever been a hardcore experience, it would never be so again for the rest of its existence. Which, as far as Takashi Tezuka was concerned, was the best thing that could ever happen to it. So what if Mario wasn't the toughest challenge around? People don't play games to get frustrated and snap their controllers in half. They play games to have fun. And Super Mario Bros. 3, whatever else it may be, is lots of fun. Not because there isn't any challenge at all, but because when there was a conflict between fun and challenge, the team put fun first. Tezuka has said on multiple occasions that in his opinion, Nintendo games are not for serious gamers or for casual gamers. They're for everybody. And while at its worst, this sentiment is just lowest common denominator pandering, at best it leads to games like Super Mario Bros. 3, which can be played at almost any skill level and still give you a fun time. You have to remember that Tezuka wasn't back in the 80s, and still isn't, a gamer, not to the extent that someone like Shigeru Miyamoto is. Miyamoto has excellent taste when it comes to what is or isn't fun, but he can also be a little stuck up about the primacy of gameplay over all else. He's a purist who often takes a jaundiced view of ancillary elements like, the story. If Miyamoto is the snobbish Siskel of Nintendo, Tezuka is more like the everyman Ebert. Nintendo of America President Reggie Fils-Aimé is often remembered for saying, "If it's not fun, why bother?" in a 2017 promotional video. But Tezuka is credited with a more positive expression of the same ethos. It's fun, so it's okay. And if you want to understand why Super Mario Bros. 3 is the way it is, the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that this game is all about that sense of freewheeling fun. You know what? That isn't the right name for this section. It kind of worked for the first two videos, but Super Mario Bros. 3 is the point when using the word story to describe what happens in a Mario game is going too far. So I'm just going to take my little magic marker here, and if you'll excuse me for a second. You see, one thing Super Mario Bros. 3 really doesn't have is a story. It has a premise. Bowser sends his 7 children to conquer the 7 other kingdoms of the Mushroom World, which it turns out the Mushroom Kingdom is only a small part of. Once there, each Koopaling stole the king's magic wand and used it to transform him into a helpless animal, then went on a rampage across his kingdom. Mario gets sent by Princess Toadstool to help the other monarchs, because this is basically his job now, and after he saves all 7, Bowser kidnaps the princess herself, taking her to his castle in the deepest depths of the Darkland where he lives. To be fair, this is more detailed than we got from the original Super Mario Bros., but that game had no ability to tell a story. It simply wouldn't have fit on the cartridge. Super Mario Bros. 2, on the other hand, took the trouble to give Mario a reason to go on the adventure, his dream, and suggest that Mario and his pals did something that led them to the world where the game takes place. It's a brief story, but it has some substance, and it sets up the nature of Subcon as a setting, and Ward as an antagonist. Super Mario Bros. 3 makes no attempt to do the same thing for the various kingdoms and Bowser, and it absolutely could have if Miyamoto and Tezuka wanted it to. There is dialogue in this game, more than had ever appeared in a Mario game before, and for the first time Princess Toadstool speaks, coming across as a character with her own voice. She's arguably the first such character in the series, since Mario himself didn't get this kind of development until years later. But the game doesn't use her dialogue to tell a story. Most of it is a glorified hint system until the final letter, which is actually sent by Bowser to mock you for letting the princess get kidnapped. If I had to use one word to describe the style of Super Mario Bros. 3, it would be stagey, and that's not an accident. Like Super Mario Bros. 2, it opens with the rising of a stage curtain, and Mario pulling some fancy moves on what looks quite a bit like a tiled floor. Every stage ends with Mario running, off stage, into a space with no background that's obviously set apart from the area he was just running around in. Even within the stages, many level elements, especially in the early worlds, bear a striking resemblance to painted flats, cobbled together props, and other simulated setting details. The overall tone is somewhere between a children's TV show and a puppet play, and the canned reactions of various characters to on-screen events is right in line with that. "Oh no, the king has been transformed. Whatever shall we do? What will become of Iceland if the Koopalings succeed?" That's not to say that this game is incapable of getting you invested when it really wants to. The artificial quality of its structure is hard to ignore, but the environmental storytelling within each world is pretty strong, and it gets better as the game goes on. One example of this is how much the game sells the idea of a full-scale invasion of the Mushroom World by Bowser. You run into evidence of his military preparations everywhere: fortresses, airships, detachments of enemies constantly on the march, and most impressively, the entirety of World 8, an intimidating gauntlet of tanks, airships, sea ships, dungeons, and fortresses that bombards you with challenge at every turn. Super Mario Bros. 3 may not have much of a fourth wall, but Bowser has never been more believable as the commander of an army than he is here. If the difficulty curve can seem a bit low at times, it's not because of him failing to do everything in his power to see Mario dead. He's not pulling a single punch on this adventure. Another guy who didn't pull any punches was Koji Kondo, the composer. Super Mario Bros. 3 has unquestionably the best music in the original trilogy, and my personal favorite soundtrack to any game from the 1980s. For the first time, every different type of level has its own unique theme, with athletic stages no longer forced to share a generic overworld theme. Not that it would matter much if they did, because this overworld theme is wonderful, with a laid-back reggae beat, synthesized steel drums, and a simple but effective bass line. The athletic theme is faster paced and can get a bit annoying if it's around for too long, but hey, these are short levels, and generally speaking, it doesn't outstay its welcome. The underground theme is a remix of the originals, not terribly interesting, but the underwater theme is totally new and fantastic. It's a shame that there's relatively few underwater sections in Super Mario Bros. 3, because this is my favorite song on its soundtrack. And since there are now two kinds of castle level, fortresses and airships, we get special music for each one, with both tunes sounding appropriately dark and menacing. But this is really just scratching the surface. Super Mario Bros. 3 has jams to last all day. Every world map has a unique jingle that suits its mood, from Grassland's jaunty boogie riff to the slow, mysterious blues motif of the pipe maze. Use a music box and you'll hear a whimsical variation of Mario's classic overworld theme. Mini-games have their own jingle. Toad houses have their own jingle. Fighting Hammer Brothers on the map screen has... well, honestly, this is too good to even be called a jingle. Generally speaking, Super Mario Bros. 3 favored variety over polish when it came to its aesthetics. It reuses a lot of art assets, like the original Super Mario Bros., but it has way more of them than that game did, so it actually bears a closer resemblance to Super Mario Bros. 2, where the graphics were more location-specific. It rarely looks beautiful, but it often looks good, and it shares with Super Mario Bros. That quality of being easy on the eyes and instantly readable, so you can tell at a glance how the level is going and what you need to do next. Which is pretty important in a game that asks you to do all kinds of different things, and more often than not, do them fast. Like I said before, Super Mario Bros. 3 has a fundamentally different structure from its two predecessors, thanks to the inclusion of the map screen. But you might be wondering, has anything changed inside the stages themselves? Well, obviously the answer is yes, but it might take you a while to realize just how deep those changes go. Superficially, this game has exactly the same kinds of stages that appeared all the way back in Super Mario Bros. Overworld stages focused on enemy encounters, athletic stages that are more platforming-based, underwater stages with a different set of movement mechanics, underground stages that tend to hem you in with a series of narrow corridors, and castle stages that ramp up both enemy and platforming difficulty while confronting you with unique obstacles. There's only one totally new kind of stage in Super Mario Bros. 3, the airship, which typically runs you past a barrage of cannons, flame shooters, and bottomless pits. In some ways, these resemble the castles of old, although the fortresses are much more like that. But one massive change is that you aren't free to move through these stages at your own pace. Instead, the screen automatically scrolls to the right, forcing you to keep up or get squished between some obstacle on the edge of the screen, which kills you. Airships aren't the only auto-scrolling stages in Super Mario Bros. 3, but they're definitely the most intimidating. It's not just the risk of getting pinched that makes them scary. There's also the fact that many challenges don't get revealed by the slowly moving screen until you're almost on top of them, making the whole experience a lot more tense. Manipulating the camera to make stages more difficult and interesting is a common Mario trick now, even in 3D entries, but it must have been quite a surprise back in 1988. Super Mario Bros. Just ratcheted the screen forward as you moved right, preventing you from going backward, but leaving you free to stop or go as you pleased. Super Mario Bros. 2, with its more exploratory approach, didn't restrict the player's movements at all. But here, there are plenty of stages where if you pause to get your bearings, you can easily get pushed into a hazard or off a platform to your death by the movement of the level itself. Another important change in level design is the inclusion of more secrets, many of which require a bit of lateral thinking to find. I said in the last video that Super Mario Bros. 3 was a return to the left-to-right, mostly horizontal design of the original game, but that wasn't entirely fair. There's actually a lot of verticality in these levels. It's just that most of the time you're not required to use it. Soaring into the air in this game is usually a way of avoiding obstacles or finding secrets, not a required means of progression. There are exceptions though, and more of them appear as you reach the later worlds. World 6, Iceland, has some particularly maze-like levels, including a stage where you have to fly up a hole in the ceiling with a Koopa shell to break open a path to the exit. And World 7 has a fortress that is just one of the more surreal stages in any 2D Mario game I've played. If I really got into the weeds here, I could talk about this game's stages for ages, and I might just do that in another video. But I've covered most of the basic changes, so let's instead take a look at Mario's new powers for a moment. If you're wondering where we suddenly got the ability to fly from, that's due to two new variations on Mario's moveset, the Power Meter and the Super Leaf. The Power Meter is a bar on the bottom of the screen that fills up when Mario runs in a straight line. Once it's full, he can bound into the air higher than usual. Of course, Mario has always jumped higher the faster he runs, but the meter is a pretty helpful indicator of when the height of his jump maxes out. More interesting is the Super Leaf, which was created to neatly solve two design problems at once. Takashi Tezuka had wanted Mario to be able to fly since the creation of Super Mario Bros. 3 years before, but he also wanted Mario to have a power-up that would let him attack enemies right next to him without being as overpowered as the Fire Flower's projectile attack. Once he realized that giving Mario a tail would let him whip enemies with it, inspiration struck, and he invented Raccoon Mario, whose tail sweeps enemies aside, but also lets him fly when combined with the liftoff provided by a fully powered-up jump. By the way, in case you're wondering why a leaf turns Mario into a raccoon man, this is a reference to the Tanuki, a Japanese creature of myth said to use magical leaves to cast transformation spells. Strictly speaking, it would make more sense for you to play as a raccoon and have the leaf turn you into an Italian plumber, but whatever works. There are several other new power-ups in Super Mario Bros. 3, but they didn't have much of a lasting impact on the franchise, not directly at least. New powers are kind of to this game what new enemies were to Super Mario Bros. 2. The game has lots of them, but they just didn't stick around. There are 3 special suits that you can find, all of them unique to this game. The frog suit makes Mario's swimming controls a lot smoother, but at the cost of making him awkward on land. The hammer suit lets Mario throw hammers into the air like a hammer bro, and these will tear most enemies to pieces, including ones that are invulnerable to everything else. And the aptly named Tanuki suit gives you the same powers as a Super Leaf, but with the addition of the ability to turn into an invulnerable statue for several seconds whenever you want. The P-Wing turns you into Raccoon Mario like a Super Leaf, but also gives you a permanently charged up power meter for a single stage, meaning you can fly as much as you like without any wind-up. Of all the power-ups, this is undoubtedly the most overpowered. It turns every outdoor level into a complete joke, and also works on most fortresses and underground stages. Only the underwater segments are immune from having their challenge ruined by this power-up, so it's a good thing that you don't get many. There's only around half a dozen of them in the entire game. This is, of course, on top of the map screen items and all 3 of the power-ups from Super Mario Bros., the Mushroom, Fire Flower, and Star, which seem to have graduated to the status of ideal platonic forms by this point, since their iconography shows up all over the place. However, the new roster of abilities has largely stolen their thunder here as power-ups. Mushrooms just feel like the lamest minigame prize, and while Fire Flowers are more useful than the Super Leaf in some situations, all I can say is that I always preferred to be Raccoon Mario whenever I could. Platforming is generally more challenging here than enemies, so anything that rescues you from bad jumps is just bound to be more desirable than an improved attack. The star is still pretty helpful though, so that's something. In fact, some levels do a lot with the star, like one that forces you along a hazardous floor with nothing to protect you but a series of easy-to-miss and hard-to-reach stars. That's a pretty clever set piece that wouldn't have worked in previous Marios, and may have inspired a certain mechanic in Yoshi's Island years later. That just leaves us with enemies, and in this aspect, as in most, Super Mario Bros. 3 really shines. The game has a huge assortment of enemies, though admittedly it gets a big boost from reusing every enemy from Super Mario Bros., with almost no changes made to their movement or attacks. Also, just like Super Mario Bros. 2, there's more than a few gimmicky, one-off enemies, including some that only appear in a single level, so for now we'll stick to the new faces that stuck around. Piranha Plants aren't technically new in Super Mario Bros. 3, but they have new attacks and are a lot more ferocious here, so they stand out more. This is the game that gave us the classic Piranha Plant design, which has inspired so many variations over the years. On the other hand, similar to the original incarnation of the Piranha Plant is the Muncher, a stationary, constantly snapping plant that would stick around as a hazard in Super Mario World. Hammer Brothers make a triumphant return, with several variations that were unique to this game until the revival of 2D Mario in the mid-2000s. Fire Brothers, who spit fireballs that move similarly to Fire Marios, Boomerang Bros, who throw a boomerang that moves in a wide arc across the screen, and Sledge Bros, giant doofy-looking bros who throw oversized hammers and can paralyze you by slamming the ground. Kind of related to Hammer Bros, possibly, are Spikes, diminutive turtle-like creatures who vomit up spiked balls, then throw them across the screen at you. These guys also didn't show back up until the new Super Mario Bros. Series, but Nintendo seems to have really embraced them in recent years. They were still part of the Bowser Brigade as of Super Mario Wonder, and they show up in spin-offs all the time too. Flying Goombas, officially known as Paragoombas, show up for the first time, as do several kinds of Micro-Goombas, including one that hides inside a block waiting to spring at you and smash said block over your hapless cranium. Then we have Rocky Wrenches. These guys are odd. They're mole-like turtles that wear goggles and hide inside the floor in airship levels, taking turns to pop out and toss wrenches at you that defy gravity by flying in a straight line. And yes, bizarre as this may sound, these guys were not originally supposed to be moles, although later games altered their design to make them more obviously mole-like. In retrospect, it's clear that the Rocky Wrench is the prototype for what later became the classic Monty Mole. Finally, we have 4 enemies that I consider particularly essential to Mario lore, not only for their unique movement and attacks, but also because they contribute a lot of atmosphere to the setting. First off, we have Dry Bones, a skeletal Koopa that only appears in fortresses. Dry Bones can't be permanently defeated by jumping on them. Instead, they collapse into a pile, which pulls itself back together a few seconds later. This was the first Mario enemy you could call undead, though by no means the last, and it's pretty spooky to be honest. I've always found these guys unnerving. Thwomps are living monoliths, with no other purpose in life than to slam down on whatever crosses their line of vision and crush the life out of it. They feel a lot more like traps than enemies, but they can be defeated using the hammer suit, and that makes them 100% enemy in my book. Thwomp is even more of a staple in both mainline Mario games and spin-offs than Dry Bones is, and there's no evidence that he's leaving the Mario series anytime soon either. The Chain Chomp is one of 2 enemies inspired by the developer's real-life experiences, in this case Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood memories of being snarled at by an angry, chained-up dog. And like a mean dog, the Chain Chomp is defined by its terrifying unpredictability. These enemies move very erratically, and it's harder to stay out of their way than you might think, especially if you need to find a power-up. Even scarier, if you dawdle too much and let the timer drop below a certain point, they can break off their chains and launch their big toothy faces right at you. Finally, we have perhaps Super Mario Bros. 3's most inspired creation, the Boo. Boos, or Boo Diddlies as they were originally called, and no, I am not making that up, look like a stereotypical Halloween ghost, except for the fanged mouth. But what makes them unique is their behavior. As long as you face in their direction, they'll stay put out of fear. But the instant you look away, they zoom toward you like they're playing red light, green light. And they're invulnerable to most attacks, so you generally have to avoid them. That isn't easy when there's 3 Boos in a room and you have to run past all of them, guaranteeing that at least one is chasing you at any given time. Boos are a perfect example of how a small change in an enemy's behavior can interact with other level elements to create an exciting challenge. It's a kind of multiplier effect. 1 Boo in an empty room is no big deal at all, but multiple Boos combined with other enemies and traps can be downright diabolical. Oh, I forgot to mention, Boos are the other enemy type based on the team's real-life experiences. The inspiration in this case turned out to be Takashi Tezuka's wife, a fairly quiet and shy woman most of the time, until one day when Miyamoto saw her blow her top and yell at her husband for spending so much time at the office, presumably because he was burning the midnight oil designing Super Mario Bros. 3. Kind of ironic, really. Boo is arguably Super Mario Bros. 3's biggest contribution to the iconography of the Mario series. Every ghostly or magical creature from then on owes something to the design and appearance of Boos, and some games, I'm thinking specifically of Super Mario World here, went absolutely crazy with them. I have to assume that someone at Nintendo really liked Boo as a character. Probably Miyamoto himself, if I were to hazard a guess. As for bosses and mini-bosses, this is where Super Mario Bros. 3 falters a little. The standard mini-boss is Boom Boom, who appears in every fortress and is, if I'm being totally honest, kind of an anticlimax. It's really easy to get into a rhythm of jumping on his head, moving away while he's invulnerable, then jumping back on his head again. And while he has several different movement patterns, you're not going to even see them most of the time, because he goes down that quickly. Birdo served much better as a recurring mini-boss because the need to have something to throw at her made you take your time and dodge her attacks. Boom Boom doesn't even have attacks, strictly speaking. He just tries to run into you, and he's simply too easy to dodge. Bowser's 7 children, the Koopalings, are more interesting, and I like the fact that each has a different gimmick during the fight with them. They could have been made a lot more interesting, though, and this just reinforces the point that for the first decade or so of Mario's existence, boss fights weren't a highlight of his games. The next time we run into the Koopalings, they'll have more to show us, though, I promise. And we end right where we ended Super Mario Bros., Bowser's Castle. This is a very tough stage, but a fun one, right up until the final boss fight with Bowser, which is... I have to be upfront here. I hate this fight. It's really cheap, and Bowser moves unlike anything else in the game. The goal, ostensibly, is to dodge Bowser's fireballs, which enrages him and makes him try to stomp you, breaking through the bricks of his floor until finally he crashes through it all the way and dies in a lava pool or something. That's how you do this boss fight if you're really patient and/or a sucker for punishment. If you're like me, on the other hand, you use one of the 3 P-Wings you saved up for this occasion to cheese your way through the castle, then fly off the screen directly above the center of the floor. Bowser can't reach you up there, but he will keep jumping up and down trying to get you, and ultimately seal his own fate by doing so. Yes, it is cowardly. Yes, it kind of makes you hate yourself. But oh my god, the relief you feel after dying to this awful boss 5 times in a row, and then just saying, screw this, I'm cheating. Ooh, it is palpable. And of course, if you're even more of a cheating bastard than I am, you just put on a hammer suit, destroy everything in Bowser's castle without even looking at it, and kill him with maybe 4 hammers, because apparently Bowser is secretly made of paper mache. But however you did it, you're at the end. Princess Toadstool is rescued, the credits roll, and you're free to look back on the wild adventure you've taken these last couple of hours, and what it all means. So let's do that. It's a testament to the inventiveness of Super Mario Bros. 3 that even though it reuses just about everything that appeared in the original Super Mario Bros., it still added more to the legacy of the franchise than either of its illustrious predecessors. Super Mario Bros. 3 is the quintessential Mario game, a template that would go on to be tinkered with and improved upon for decades to come. Even after Mario entered the 3rd dimension and totally abandoned the approach of the original trilogy, that world map and its design implications could still be seen in every new entry. With the resurgence of 2D Mario in the mid-2000s, beginning with New Super Mario Bros. In 2006, this became even more obvious. The whole New Super Mario Bros. Series took a lot of pointers from the design of this game, both mechanically and aesthetically. Just look at those world themes. It's no coincidence that half a dozen enemies which had only previously appeared in Super Mario Bros. 3 suddenly cropped back up when Mario returned to its 2D roots. This was just the final confirmation of the essential truth that if you're going to make a retro 2D platformer, this is what you want it to look and play like. Super Mario World, the first 16-bit game in the series, was a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Shovel Knight is a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Heck, with a little imagination, you could even say that Mario Party is basically a variation on Super Mario Bros. 3. Just replace the stages with minigames and the minigames with chance time, and you're halfway there already. But let's not get too worked up here. In some respects, the story in particular, this game is a bit of a lightweight. It introduced no new characters except for the Koopalings, who are only debatably characters anyway. Even Birdo ended up with spoken dialogue before these guys did, since for a long time they were basically retconned in favor of stories featuring Bowser Jr. What else even is there from a story perspective? Princess Toadstool talking? I guess that's something, but it's a pretty bare foundation to build a character off of. Arguably, most Mario characters only have real personalities in the RPGs and a few other spin-offs. The mainline series has deliberately kept them simple and straightforward. Except for Sunshine, but that's definitely a topic for another day. Now here we're on firmer ground. Super Mario Bros. 3 is a treasure trove of new enemies and mechanics. Here we find the definitive versions of most of the original Super Mario Bros. Foes, plus at least a dozen more that either settled into the franchise for the long haul, or at least inspired long-running enemy characters in later entries. 4 enemies proved to be especially influential in later games: Dry Bones, Thwomps, Chain Chomps, and Boos, all of which are series mascots of a sort, appearing in not just mainline Mario games, but also the racing games, sports games, and many other spin-offs. The Super Leaf didn't return for a long time, but if you think of it as just the flying power-up, flying definitely became an essential Mario concept for years to come. The cape in Super Mario World, the wing cap in Super Mario 64, Flood in Super Mario Sunshine, Be Mario from Galaxy. This was an idea with legs. And how about those world themes? Grassland, Desertland, Waterland, Iceland, the Dark World. These ideas all seem stale now just because they've been used so many times. In the case of the first three, often in exactly the same order. But that's not this game's fault. Really, it just shows how fundamentally appealing these themes are. And I would argue that Super Mario Bros. 3 does them the best of any game that's tried. Finally, let's not forget about the new stage concepts this game introduced. Auto-scrolling stages are the most obvious innovation, but there's also the increased focus on puzzle solving and thorough level exploration, directly inspiring some of the weirder and more out-there aspects of Super Mario World, a game that has a lot more in common with Super Mario Bros. 3 than I've seen most people acknowledge. As for overall design contributions, the most momentous has to be the invention of the world map and everything that went with it. Before Super Mario Bros. 3, the Mario series didn't really have its own unique way of presenting levels to the player. The strict level-by-level progression wasn't that different from what you'd see in a game like Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania. Compare this with, say, Mega Man, which back in 1987 was already shaking things up by letting you play through its first 6 levels in any order. Now, in 1988, the Mushroom Kingdom had a unique structural hook that told the world, this is Mario, and the way his games work isn't the same as anyone else's. Super Mario Bros. 3 gave us the concept of a minigame with power-ups as prizes, too, creating a sideline of the Mario franchise, which eventually became its own sub-series, Mario Party. I know that I called the slot machine from the last game a minigame, but that was a stretch. I don't have any problem referring to the card-matching game that way, and this is what I see the minigame concept growing out of. Another new idea was the contrast between fortresses and castles, which gave each individual world more structure and a sense of progression that didn't exist before. And finally, on a very broad level, the whole idea that each world in a Mario game needs to have a theme and a name started here. The worlds in the first 2 Mario games weren't named, they were numbered. And as unique as some of them were, they aren't as memorable as a place you can put a name to. They just don't have that sense of personality that this game's kingdoms have. When you get right down to it, personality is the secret sauce that makes Super Mario Bros. 3 a blast to play, whether you're doing well at it or not. The first 2 games in the series both tried to do something radically new, and succeeded in making it fun. But Super Mario Bros. 3 went beyond that with an abundance of little details that hadn't even been considered before. Whenever you find a Nintendo game like this that abounds in charming details, it's a pretty safe bet that Takashi Tezuka had something to do with it. He was involved with The Legend of Zelda from the very beginning, which is probably why Zelda has always been a pretty quirky series with strong characters. A Link to the Past is practically the apotheosis of quirkery. But Mario didn't start out that way. It needed someone like Tezuka to step in and paint in all those corners that no one else had noticed before. Not everything he created for this game makes a ton of sense. Not all of it is challenging. Not all of it is cool. But it's almost always a lot of fun. And that makes it okay.